The front of the gray, paintless house facing west was luminous as the moon is. The gray, dusty track in the yard before the door stood out magically in this light, in the overdrawn perspective of a stereopticon. The people, too, were changed in the evening, quieted. They seemed to be a part of an organization of the unconscious. They obeyed impulses which registered only faintly in their thinking minds. Their eyes were inward and quiet, and their eyes, too, were lucid in the evening, lucid in dusty faces. The family met at the most important place, near the truck. The house was dead, and the fields were dead, but this truck was the active thing, the living principle. The ancient Hudson, with bent and scarred radiator screen, with grease and dusty globules at the worn edge of every moving part, with hubcaps gone and caps of red dust in their places. This was the new hearth, the living center of the family, half passenger car and half truck, high-sided and clumsy. Paul walked around the truck looking at it, and then he squatted down in the dust and found a stick to draw with. One foot was flat to the ground, the other rested on the ball and slightly back, so that one knee was higher than the other. Left forearm rested on the lower left knee, the right elbow on the right knee, and the right fist cupped for the chin. Pa squatted there looking at the truck, his chin in his cupped fist, and Uncle John moved toward him and squatted down beside him. Their eyes were brooding. Grandpa came out of the house and saw the two squatting together, and he jerked over and sat on the running board of the truck facing them. That was the nucleus. Tom and Connie and Noah strolled in and squatted, and the line was a half circle, with Grandpa in the opening. And then Ma came out of the house, and Grandma with her, and Rosa Sharon behind, walking daintily. They took their places behind the squatting men. They stood up and put their hands on their hips, and the children, Ruthie and Winfield, hopped from foot to foot beside the women. The children squidged their toes in the red dust, but they made no sound. Only the preacher was not there. He, out of delicacy, was sitting on the ground behind the house. He was a good preacher and knew his people. The evening light grew softer, and for a while the family sat and stood silently. Then Pa, speaking to no one but to the group, made his report. Got skinned on the stuff we sold. The fella knowed we couldn't wait. Got $18 only. Ma stirred restively, but she held her peace. Noah, the oldest son, asked, "How much, all added up, we got?" Pa drew figures in the dust and mumbled to himself for a moment. "154, he said, "but Al here says we're gonna need better tires. Says these here won't last." This was Al's first participation in the conference. Always he had stood behind with the women before, and now he made his report solemnly. "She's old and she's ornery," he said gravely. "I gave the whole thing a good going over before we bought her. Didn't listen to the fellow talking what a hell of a bargain she was. Stuck my finger in the differential and there wasn't no sawdust. Opened the gearbox and there wasn't no sawdust. Test her clutch and rolled her wheels for line. Went under her and her frame ain't splayed none. She never been rolled. Seen they was a cracked cell in her battery and made the fellow put in a good one. Tires ain't worth a damn, but they're a good size, easy to get. She'll ride like a bull calf, but she ain't shooting no oil. Reason I says buy her is she was a poplar car. Wrecking yards is full of Hudson Super 6s, and you can buy parts cheap. Could have got a bigger, fancier car for the same money, but parts too hard to get and too dear. That's how I figured her anyways." The last was his submission to the family. He stopped speaking and waited for their opinions. Grandpa was still the titular head, but he no longer ruled. His position was honorary and a matter of custom, but he did have the right of first comment, no matter how silly his old mind might be, and the squatting men and the standing women waited for him. "You're all right, Al," Grandpa said. "I was a squirt just like you, farting around like a dog wolf, but when there was a job, I done it. You've growed up good." He finished in the tone of benediction, and Al reddened a little with pleasure. Pa said, "Sounds right side up to me. If it was horses, we wouldn't have to put the blame on Al, but Al's the only automobile fella here." Tom said, "I know some, worked some in McAllister. Al's right, he done good." And now Al was rosy with the compliment. Tom went on, "I'd like to say, well, that preacher, he wants to go along." He was silent. His words lay in the group, and the group was silent. "He's a nice fella," Tom added. "We've known him a long time. Talks a little wild sometimes, but he talks sensible." And he relinquished the proposal to the family. The light was going gradually. Ma left the group and went into the house, and the iron clang of the stove came from the house. In a moment she walked back to the brooding council. Grandpa said, "They was two ways of thinking. Some folks used to figure that a preacher was poison luck." Tom said, "That this fella says he ain't a preacher no more." Grandpa waved his hand back and forth. Once a fella's a preacher, he's always a preacher. That's something you can't get shut of. They was some folks figured it was a good, respectable thing to have a preacher along. If somebody died, a preacher buried him. Wedding come due or overdue, and there's your preacher. Baby come, and you got a christener right under the roof. Me, I always said they was preachers and preachers. Got to pick 'em. I kind of like this fella. He ain't stiff. Pa dug his stick into the dust and rolled it between his fingers so that it bored a little hole. There's more to this than is he lucky or is he nice fella, Pa said. We got to figure close. It's a sad thing to figure close. Let's see. Now there's Grandpa and Grandma. That's 2. And me and John and Ma. That's 5. And Noah and Tommy and Al. That's 8. Rosa Sharon and Connie is 10. And Ruthie and Winfield's 12. We got to take the dogs, because what'll we do else? Can't shoot a good dog. And there ain't nobody to give 'em to. And that's 14. Not counting what chickens is left, and 2 pigs, said Noah. Pa said, I aim to get those pigs salted down to eat on the way. We're going to need meat. Carry the salt kegs right with us, but I'm wondering if we can all ride. And the preacher, too. And can we feed an extra mouth? Without turning his head, he asked, Can we, Ma? Ma cleared her throat. It ain't can we, it's will we, she said firmly. As far as can, we can't do nothing. Not go to California or nothing. But as far as will, why, we'll do what we will. And as far as will, it's a long time our folks been here in East before, and I never heerd tell of no Jodes or no Haslets neither ever refusing food and shelter or a lift on the road to anybody that asked. They's been mean Jodes, but never that mean. Pa broke in, but suppose there just ain't room. He had twisted his neck to look up at her, and he was ashamed. Her tone had made him ashamed. Suppose we just can't all get in the truck. There ain't room now, she said. There ain't room for more'n 6, and 12 is going sure. One more ain't gonna hurt. And a man strong and healthy ain't never no burden. Any time when we got 2 pigs and over $100, and we wondering if we can feed a fella, she stopped and Pa turned back, and his spirit was raw from the whipping. Grandma said, A preacher is a nice thing to be with us. He give a nice grace this morning. Pa looked at the face of each one for dissent, and then he said, Want to call him over, Tommy? If he's going, he ought to be here. Tom got up from his hams and went toward the house, calling, Casey, oh Casey. A muffled voice replied from behind the house. Tom walked to the corner and saw the preacher sitting back against the wall, looking at the flashing evening star in the light sky. Calling me? Casey asked. Yeah. We think long as you're going with us, you ought to be over here helping to figure things out. Casey got to his feet. He knew the government of families, and he knew he had been taken into the family. Indeed, his position was eminent, for Uncle John moved sideways, leaving a space between Pa and himself for the preacher. Casey squatted down like the others, facing Grandpa enthroned on the running board. Ma went to the house again. There was a screech of a lantern hood, and the yellow light flashed up in the dark kitchen. When she lifted the lid of the big pot, the smell of boiling side meat and beet greens came out the door. They waited for her to come back across the darkening yard, for Ma was powerful in the group. Pa said, We got to figure when to start. Sooner the better. What we got to do before we go is to get them pigs slaughtered and in salt and pack our stuff and go. Quicker the better, Nell. Noah agreed. If we pitch in, we can get ready tomorrow and we can go bright the next day. Uncle John objected. Can't chill no meat in the heat of the day. Wrong time of year for slaughter, and meat'll be soft if it don't chill. Well, let's do her tonight. She'll chill tonight some, much as she's gonna. After we eat, let's get her done. Got salt? Ma said yes, got plenty of salt. Got 2 nice kegs, too. Well, let's get her done then, said Tom. Grandpa began to scrabble about, trying to get a purchase to arise. Getting dark, he said. I'm getting hungry. Come time we get to California, I'll have a big bunch of grapes in my hand all the time and nibbling off it all the time, by God. He got up and the men arose. Ruthie and Winfield hopped excitedly about in the dust like crazy things. Ruthie whispered hoarsely to Winfield, Killing pigs and going to California. Killing pigs and going, all at the same time. And Winfield was reduced to madness. He stuck his finger against his throat, made a horrible face, and wobbled about, weakly shrilling, I'm a big old pig. Look, I'm a big old pig. Look at the blood, Ruthie. And he staggered and sank to the ground and waved arms and legs weakly. But Ruthie was older, and she knew the tremendousness of the time. And going to California, she said again. And she knew this was the great time in her life so far. The adults moved toward the lighted kitchen through the deep dusk, and Ma served them greens and side meat in tin plates. But before Ma ate, she put the big round wash tub on the stove and started the fire roaring. She carried buckets of water until the tub was full, and then around the tub she clustered the buckets full of water. The kitchen became a swamp of heat, and the family ate hurriedly and went out to sit on the doorstep until the water should get hot. They sat looking out at the dark, at the square of light the kitchen lantern threw on the ground outside the door, with a hunched shadow of Grandpa in the middle of it. Noah picked his teeth thoroughly with a broom straw. Ma and Rosa Sharon washed up the dishes and piled them on the table. And then, all of a sudden, the family began to function. Pa got up and lighted another lantern. Noah, from a box in the kitchen, brought out the bow-bladed butchering knife and whetted it on a worn carborundum stone. And he laid the scraper on the chopping block and the knife beside it. Pa brought 2 sturdy sticks, each 3 feet long, and pointed the ends with an axe. He tied strong ropes, double hitched, to the middle of the sticks. He grumbled, shouldn't have sold those single trees, all of them. The water in the pot steamed and rolled. Noah asked, "You gonna take the water down there or bring the pigs up here?" "Pigs up here," said Pa. "You can't spill a pig and scald yourself like you can hot water. Water about ready?" "About, huh?" "All right. Noah, you and Tom and Al come along. I'll carry the light. We'll slaughter down there and bring 'em up here." Noah took his knife and Al the axe, and the 4 men moved down the sty, their legs flickering in the lantern light. Ruthie and Winfield skittered along, hopping over the ground. At the sty, Paul leaned over the fence holding the lantern. The sleepy young pigs struggled to their feet, grunting suspiciously. Uncle John and the preacher walked down to help. "All right," said Pa, "stick 'em and we'll run 'em up and bleed and scald at the house." Noah and Tom stepped over the fence. They slaughtered quickly and efficiently. Tom struck twice with the blunt head of the axe, and Noah, leaning over the felled pigs, found the great artery with his curving knife and released the pulsing streams of blood. Then over the fence with the squealing pigs. The preacher and Uncle John dragged one by the hind legs, and Tom and Noah the other. Pa walked along with the lantern, and the black blood made 2 trails in the dust. At the house, Noah slipped his knife between tendon and bone of the hind legs. The pointed sticks held the legs apart, and the carcasses were hung from the 2x4 rafters that stuck out from the house. Then the men carried the boiling water and poured it over the black bodies. Noah slit the bodies from end to end and dropped the entrails out on the ground. Pa sharpened 2 more sticks to hold the bodies open to take out the air, while Tom with the scrubber and Ma with a dull knife scraped the skins to take out the bristles. Al brought a bucket and shoveled the entrails into it and dumped them on the ground far away from the house. And 2 cats followed him, mewing loudly, and the dogs followed him, growling lightly at the cats. Paul sat on the doorstep and looked at the pigs hanging in the lantern light. The scraping was done now, and only a few drops of blood continued to fall from the carcasses into the black pool on the ground. Paul got up and went to the pigs and felt them with his hand, and then he sat down again. Grandma and Grandpa went toward the barn to sleep, and Grandpa carried a candle lantern in his hand. The rest of the family sat quietly about the doorstep, Connie and Al and Tom on the ground, leaning their backs against the house wall, Uncle John on a box, Pa in the doorway. Only Ma and Rosa Sharon continued to move about. Ruthie and Winfield were sleepy now, but fighting it off. They quarreled sleepily out in the darkness. Noah and the preacher squatted side by side facing the house. Pa scratched himself nervously and took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "Tomorrow we'll get that pork salted early in the morning. Then we'll get the truck loaded, all but the beds, and next morning off we'll go." "Hardly as a day's work and all that," he said uneasily. Tom broke in. "We'll be mooning around all day looking for something to do." The group stirred uneasily. "We could get ready by daylight and go," Tom suggested. Paul rubbed his knee with his hand, and the restiveness spread to all of them. Noah said, "Probably wouldn't hurt that meat to get her right down in the salt. Cut her up, she'll cool quicker anyways." It was Uncle John who broke over the edge. His pressure's too great. "What we hanging around for? I want to get shut of this. Now we're going, why don't we go?" And the revulsion spread to the rest. "Why don't we go? Get sleep on the way." And a sense of hurry crept into them. Pa said, "They say it's 2,000 miles. That's a hell of a long ways. We ought to go. Noah, you and me can get that meat cut up when we can put all the stuff in the truck." Ma put her head out the door. "How about if we forget something, not seeing it in the dark?" "We could look around after daylight," said Noah. They sat still then, thinking about it, but in a moment Noah got up and began to sharpen the bow-bladed knife on his little worn stone. "Ma," he said, get that table cleared." And he stepped to a pig, cut a line down one side of the backbone, and began peeling the meat toward the ribs. Paul stood up excitedly. We got to get the stuff together, he said. Come on, you fellas. Now that they were committed to going, the hurry infected all of them. Noah carried the slabs of meat into the kitchen and cut it into small salting blocks, and Ma patted the coarse salt in and laid it piece by piece in the kegs, careful that no two pieces touched each other. She laid the slabs like bricks and pounded salt in the spaces. And Noah cut up the side meat and he cut up the legs. Ma kept her fire going, and as Noah cleaned the ribs and spines and leg bones of all the meat he could, she had put them in the oven to roast for gnawing purposes. In the yard and in the barn, the circles of lantern light moved about, and the men brought together all the things to be taken and piled them by the truck. Rosa Sharon brought out all the clothes the family possessed, the overalls, the thick-soled shoes, the rubber boots, the worn best suits, the sweaters and sheepskin coats, and she packed these tightly into a wooden box and got into the box and tramped them down. And then she brought out the print dresses and shawls, the black cotton stockings and the children's clothes, small overalls and cheap print dresses, and she put these in the box and tramped them down. Tom went to the tool shed and brought what tools were left to go: a handsaw and a set of wrenches, a hammer and a box of assorted nails, a pair of pliers and a flat file, and a set of rat-tail files. And Rosa Sharon brought out the big piece of tarpaulin and spread it on the ground behind the truck. She struggled through the door with the mattresses, 3 double ones and a single. She piled them on the tarpaulin, excuse me guys, I'm sorry, and brought armloads of folded ragged blankets and piled them up. Ma and Noah worked busily at the carcasses, and the smell of roasting pork bones came from the stove. The children had fallen by the way in the late night. Winfield lay curled up in the dust outside the door, and Ruthie, sitting on a box in the kitchen where she had gone to watch the butchering, had dropped her head back against the wall. She breathed easily in her sleep, and her lips were parted over her teeth. Tom finished with the tools and came into the kitchen with his lantern, and the preacher followed him. "God in a buckboard," Tom said. "Smell that meat, and listen to her crackle." Ma laid the bricks of meat in the keg and poured salt around and over them and covered a layer with salt and patted it down. She looked up at Tom and smiled a little at him, but her eyes were serious and tired. "Be nice to have pork bones for breakfast," she said. The preacher stepped beside her. "Leave me salt down this meat," he said. "I can do it. There's other stuff for you to do." She stopped her work and then inspected him oddly, as though he suggested a curious thing. And her hands were crusted with salt, pink with fluid from the flesh of pork. It's women's work," she said finally. "It's all work," the preacher replied. "They's way too much of it to split up to men or women's work. You got stuff to do. Leave me salt the meat." Still for a moment she stared at him, and then she poured water from a bucket into the tin wash basin, and she washed her hands. The preacher took up the blocks of pork and patted on the salt while she watched him, and he laid them in kegs as she had. Only when he finished a layer and covered it carefully and patted down the salt was she satisfied. She dried her bleached and bloated hands. Tom said, "Ma, what stuff we going to take from here?" She looked quickly about the kitchen. "The bucket," she said. "All the stuff to eat with, plates and the cups, the spoons and knives and forks. Put all them in that drawer and take the drawer. The big fry pan and the big stew kettle, the coffee pot. When it gets cool, take the rack out of the oven. That's good over a fire. I'd like to take the wash tub, but I guess there ain't room. I'll wash clothes in the bucket. Don't do no good to take little stuff. You can cook little stuff in a big kettle, but you can't cook big stuff in a little pot. Take the bread pans, all of them. They fit down inside of each other." She stood and looked about the kitchen. "You just take that stuff I told you, Tom. I'll fix up the rest. The big can of pepper and the salt and the nutmeg and the grater. I'll take all that stuff just at the last." She picked up a lantern and walked heavily into the bedroom, and her bare feet made no sound on the floor. The preacher said, "She looks tired." "Women's always tired," said Tom. "That's just the way women is, 'cept at meetin' once and again." "Yeah, but tired'n that. Real tired, like she's sick tired." Ma was just through the door, and she heard his words. Slowly her relaxed face tightened, and the lines disappeared from the taut, muscular face. Her eyes sharpened and her shoulders straightened. She glanced about the stripped room. Nothing was left in it except trash. The mattresses, which had been on the floor, were gone. The bureaus were sold. On the floor lay a broken comb, an empty talcum powder can, and a few dust mice. Ma set her lantern on the floor. She reached behind one of the boxes that had served as chairs and brought out a stationery box, old and soiled and cracked at the corners. She sat down and opened the box. Inside were letters, clippings, photographs, a pair of earrings, a little gold signet ring, and a watch chain braided of hair and tipped with gold swivels. She touched the letters with her fingers, touched them lightly, and she smoothed the newspaper clipping on which there was an account of Tom's trial. For a long time she held the box, looking over it, and her fingers disturbed the letters and then lined them up again. She bit her lower lip, thinking, remembering, and at last she made up her mind. She picked out the ring, the watch charm, the earrings, dug under the pile, and found one gold cufflink. She took a letter from an envelope and dropped the trinkets in the envelope. Then gently and tenderly she closed the box and smoothed the top carefully with her fingers. Her lips parted. Then she stood up, took her lantern, and went back into the kitchen. She lifted the stove lid and laid the box gently among the coals. Quickly the heat browned the paper. A flame licked up and over the box. She replaced the stove lid and instantly the fire sighed up and breathed over the box. Out in the dark yard, working in the lantern light, Pa and Al loaded the truck. Tools on the bottom, but handy to reach in case of a breakdown. Boxes of clothes next, and kitchen utensils in a gunny sack. Cutlery and dishes in their box. Then the gallon bucket tied on behind. They made the bottom of the load as even as possible and filled the spaces between boxes with rolled blankets. Then over the top they laid the mattresses, filling the truck in level. And last they spread the big tarpaulin over the load, and Al made holes in the edge 2 feet apart and inserted little ropes and tied it down to the sidebars of the truck. Now, if it rains, he said, we'll tie it to the bar above, and the folks can get underneath out of the wet. We'll be dry enough. Pa applauded. That's a good idea. That ain't all, Al said. First chance I get, I'm going to find a long plank and make a ridgepole and put a tarp over that, and then it'll be covered in and folks will be out of the sun, too. Pa agreed. That's a good idea. Why didn't you think of that before? I ain't had time, said Al. Ain't had time? Why, Al, you had time to coyote all over the country. God knows where you've been the last 2 weeks. Stuff a fella got to do before he's leaving the country, said Al, and then he lost some of his assurance. Pa, he asked, you glad to be going, Pa? Huh? Well, sure. Leastwise, yeah. We had hard times here. Of course it'll be all different out there. Plenty of work and everything nice and green and little white houses and oranges growing around. Is it all oranges everywhere? Well, maybe not everywhere, but plenty places. The first gray of daylight began in the sky, and the work was done. The kegs of pork ready, the chicken coop ready to go on top. Ma opened the oven and took out the pile of roasted bones, crisp and brown, with plenty of gnawing meat left. Ruthie half awakened and slipped down from the box and slept again, but the adults stood around the door shivering a little and gnawing at the crisp pork. Guess we ought to wake up Grandma and Grandpa, Tom said, getting along on toward day. Ma said, kinda hate to, till the last minute. They need to sleep. Ruthie and Winfield ain't hardly got no real rest either. Well, they can all sleep on top of the load, said Pa. It'll be nice and comfortable there. Suddenly the dog started up from the dust and listened, and then, with a roar, went barking off into the darkness. Now what in the hell is that? Pa demanded. In a moment they heard a voice speaking reassuringly to the barking dogs, and the barking lost its fierceness. Then footsteps, and a man approached. It was Molly Graves, his hat pulled low. He came near timidly. Mornin', folks, he said. Why, Molly, Pa waved the ham bone he held. Step in and get some pork for yourself, Molly. Well, no, said Molly. I ain't hungry exactly. Oh, get it, Molly, get it. Here. Pa stepped in the house and brought out a hand of spare ribs. I wasn't aiming to eat none of your stuff, he said. I was just walking around and I thought how you'd be going and I'd maybe say goodbye. Going in a little while now, said Pa. You'd have missed us if you'd come an hour later, all packed up, see? All packed up. Molly looked back at the loaded truck. Sometimes I wish I'd go and find my folks. Ma asked, did you hear from 'em out in California? No, said Molly. I ain't heard, but I ain't been to look in the post office. I ought to go in sometimes. Pa said, Al, go down and wake up Grandma and Grandpa. Tell 'em to come and eat. We're going before long. And as Al sauntered toward the barn, Molly, you want to squeeze in with us and go? We'd try to make room for you. Molly took a bite of meat from the edge of a rib bone and chewed it. Sometimes I think I might, but I know I won't, he said. I know perfectly well the last minute I'd run and hide like a damn old graveyard ghost. Noah said, you're going to die out in the field someday, Molly. I know. I thought about that. Sometimes it seems pretty lonely, and sometimes it seems all right. And sometimes it seems good. It don't make no difference. But if you come across my folks, that's really what I come to say. If you come on any of my folks in California, tell 'em I'm well. Tell 'em I'm doing all right. Don't let on I'm living this way. Tell 'em I'll come to 'em as soon as I get the money. Ma asked, and will you? No, Molly said softly. No, I won't. I can't go away. I got to stay now. Time back I might have went, but not now. Fella gets to thinking. and he gets to knowing. I ain't never going. The light of the dawn was a little sharper now. It paled the lanterns a little. Al came back with Grandpa struggling and limping by his side. He was sleeping, Al said. He was setting out back of the barn. They's something wrong with him. Grandpa's eyes had dulled, and there was none of the old meanness in them. Ain't nothing the matter with me, he said. I just ain't a-going. Not going? Pa demanded. What you mean you ain't a-going? Why, here we're all packed up ready. We got to go. We got no place to stay. I ain't saying for you to stay, said Grandpa. You go right along. Me, I'm staying. I give her a going over all night, mostly. This here's my country. I belong here. And I don't give a goddamn if they's oranges and grapes crowding a fella out of bed even. I ain't a-going. This country ain't no good, but it's my country. Nah, you all go ahead. I'll just stay right here where I belong. They crowded near to him. Pa said, You can't, Grandpa. This here land is going under the tractors. Who'd cook for you? How'd you live? You can't stay here. Why, with nobody to take care of you, you'd starve. Grandpa cried, God damn it, I'm an old man, but I can still take care of myself. How's Molly here get along? I can get along good as him. I tell you I ain't going, and you can lump it. Take Grandma with you if you want, but you ain't taking me, and that's the end of it. Pa said helplessly. Now listen to me, Grandpa. Just listen to me. Just a minute. Ain't a-gonna listen. I told you what I'm a-gonna do. Tom touched his father on the shoulder. Pa, come in the house. I want to tell you something. And as they moved toward the house, he called, Ma, come here a minute, will you? In the kitchen, one lantern burned and the plate of pork bones was still piled high. Tom said, Listen. I know Grandpa got the right to say he ain't going, but he can't stay. We know that. Sure he can't stay, said Pa. Well, look. If we got to catch him and tie him down, we liable to hurt him. And he'll get so mad, he'll hurt himself. Now, we can't argue with him. If we could get him drunk, it'd be all right. You got any whiskey? No, said Pa. There ain't a drop of whiskey in the house, and John got no whiskey. He never has none when he ain't drinking. Ma said, Tom, I got half a bottle of soothing syrup I got for Winfield when he had them earaches. Think that might work? Used to put Winfield to sleep when his earache was bad. Might, said Tom. Get it, Ma. We'll give her a try anyways. I throwed it out on the trash pile, said Ma. She took the lantern and went out, and in a moment she came back with a bottle half full of black medicine. Tom took it from her and tasted it. Don't taste bad, he said. Make a cup of black coffee, good and strong. Let's see, says 1 teaspoon. Better put in a lot, a couple of tablespoons. Ma opened the stove and put a kettle inside, down next to the coals, and she measured water and coffee into it. Have to give it to him in a can, she said. We got the cups all packed. Tom and his father went back outside. Fellow got a right to say what he's going to do. Say, who's eating spare ribs, said Grandpa. We've ate, said Tom. Ma's fixing you a cup of coffee and some pork. He went into the house and he drank his coffee and ate his pork. The group outside in the growing dawn watched him quietly through the door. They saw him yawn and sway. They saw him put his arms on the table and rest his head on his arms and go to sleep. He was tired anyways, said Tom. Leave him be. Now they were ready. Grandma, giddy and vague, saying, What's all this? What you doing now so early? But she was dressed and agreeable. And Ruthie and Winfield were awake but quiet with the pressure of tiredness and still half dreaming. The light was sifting rapidly over the land, and the movement of the family stopped. They stood about, reluctant to make the first active move to go. They were afraid, now that the time had come. Afraid in the same way Grandpa was afraid. They saw the shed take shape against the light, and they saw the lanterns pale until they no longer cast their shadow circles of yellow light. The stars went out few by few toward the west, and still the family stood about like dream walkers, their eyes focused panoramically, seeing no detail but the whole dawn, the whole land, the whole texture of the country at once. Only Molly Graves prowled about restlessly, looking through the bars into the truck. Thumping spare tires hung on the back of the truck, and at last Molly approached. Tom, you going over the state line? He asked. You going to break your parole? And Tom shook himself free from the numbness. Jesus Christ, it's near sunrise, he said loudly. We got to get going. And the others came out of their numbness and moved toward the truck. Come on, Tom said. Let's get Grandpa on. Pa and Uncle John and Tom and Al went in the kitchen where Grandpa slept, his forehead down on his arms, and a line of drying coffee on the table. They took him under the elbows and lifted him to his feet, and he grumbled and cursed thickly like a drunken man. Out the door they boosted him, and when they came to the truck, Tom and Al climbed up, and leaning over, hooked their hands under his arms and lifted gently up, and laid him on top of the load. Al untied the tarpaulin, and they rolled him under and put a box under the tarp beside him so that the weight of the heavy canvas would not be upon him. I got to get that ridgepole fixed, said Al. Do her tonight when we stop. Grandpa grunted and fought weakly against awakening, and when he was finally settled, he went deeply to sleep again. Pa said, Ma, you and Grandma sit in with Al for a while. We'll change around so it's easier, but you start out that way. They got into the cab, and the rest swarmed up on top of the load. Connie and Rosa Sharon, Pa and Uncle John, Ruthie and Winfield, Tom and the preacher. Noah stood on the ground looking up at the great load and them sitting on top of the truck. Al walked around looking underneath at the springs. Holy Jesus, he said. Them springs is flat as hell. Lucky I blocked 'em under. Noah said, How about the dogs, Pa? I forgot the dogs, Pa said. He whistled shrilly, and one bouncing dog ran in, but only one. Noah caught him and threw him up on the top, where he sat rigid and shivering at the height. Got to leave the other two, Pa called. Molly, will you look after him some? Said Pa called. Molly, will you look after him some? See they don't starve? Yeah, said Molly. I like to have a couple dogs. Yeah, I'll take 'em. Take the chickens, too, Pa said. Al got into the driver's seat. The starter whirred and caught and whirred again. And then the loose roar of the 6 cylinders and a blue smoke behind. So long, Molly, Al called. And the family called, Goodbye, Molly. Al slipped in the low gear and let in the clutch. The truck shuddered and strained across the yard, and the second gear took hold. They crawled up the hill, and the red dust rose about them. Christ, what a load, said Al. We ain't making no time on this trip. Ma tried to look back, but the body of the load cut off her view. She straightened her eyes and peered straight ahead along the dirt road, and a great weariness was in her eyes. The people on top of the load did look back. They saw the house and the barn and a little smoke rising from the chimney. They saw the windows reddening under the first color of the sun. They saw Molly standing forlornly in the dooryard, looking after them. And then the hill cut them off. The cotton field lined the road, and the truck crawled slowly through the dust toward the highway in the west.